Commander Sarah Martinez stood at the edge of the rocky cliff, watching through her binoculars as enemy forces moved through the valley below. The morning sun cast long shadows across the desert landscape of Afghanistan, but there was no beauty in this moment for her. Only the cold reality that her team was trapped, outnumbered, and running out of options. Her radio crackled to life. "Commander, this is base. We've got eyes on at least 40 hostiles moving toward your position. Extraction is still 12 hours out. What's your status?" Sarah lowered the binoculars and pressed the radio button. "We're holding position, but barely. Lost 2 good men in the night raid, down to 8 operational team members and running low on ammunition." She paused, looking back at her remaining Navy SEALs who were positioned behind makeshift cover. "We'll hold as long as we can." The truth was harder than what she told base command. Sarah had been leading SEAL teams for 8 years and she had never faced odds this bad. They had been dropped into this remote mountain region 3 days ago to gather intelligence on a suspected terrorist training camp. What they found was much bigger than anyone had expected. This wasn't just a small training facility. It was a major operational base with dozens of experienced fighters. The mission had gone wrong almost from the start. Their helicopter had been spotted on approach, forcing them to land 2 miles from the target. Then, as they moved toward the compound under cover of darkness, they walked into an ambush. The enemy knew they were coming. Petty Officer James Rodriguez crawled over to where Sarah was positioned. His left arm was wrapped in a bloody bandage, but his eyes were still sharp and focused. "Commander, I've been thinking about our options. We could try to move through that canyon to the east. It might give us better defensive positions." Sarah shook her head. "Too risky. They'd spot us crossing the open ground. We'd be sitting ducks?" She studied the terrain again. The enemy had them pinned on this rocky outcrop with only one way down, and that path was completely exposed. "What's our ammunition count?" "Not good. Most of the guys are down to their last magazine. We lost most of our gear when Johnson and Stevens were hit." Rodriguez's voice was steady, but Sarah could hear the concern underneath. These were professional soldiers, but they were also human. They knew how desperate their situation had become. Sarah had served 3 tours in Afghanistan and 2 in Iraq. She had seen plenty of combat and had always found a way to bring her people home. But this felt different. The enemy seemed to know their every move before they made it. It was like fighting ghosts who could read their minds. The radio buzzed again. "Commander Martinez, be advised that weather is moving in from the west. Heavy cloud cover expected within 4 hours. This may affect extraction timeline." That was the last thing they needed. Bad weather would make it impossible for helicopters to reach them, and it would give the enemy even more advantages. Sarah looked up at the sky and could already see dark clouds building on the horizon. Chief Petty Officer Michael Thompson joined them at their observation post. At 42, he was the oldest member of the team and had more combat experience than anyone. "Commander, I've been watching their movement patterns. They're not just trying to overrun us. They're hurting us somewhere specific." "What do you mean?" Sarah asked, though she was starting to understand what Thompson was getting at. "Look at how they're positioning. Every time we try to move in certain directions, they put heavy fire on us. But they're leaving that southern route relatively open. I think they want us to go that way." Thompson pointed toward a narrow path that led down into a smaller valley. "Question is, what's waiting for us down there?" Sarah realized Thompson was right. In all the chaos and pressure of the last day, she had been thinking defensively, trying to hold their position. But the enemy wasn't just attacking randomly. They had a plan, and her team was being manipulated into following it. She called the other team members over for a quick briefing. Looking at the faces of these men who had followed her into countless dangerous situations, Sarah felt the weight of command more heavily than ever. These weren't just soldiers under her command. They were friends, family members, people with wives and children waiting for them to come home. "Listen up. We're not just fighting to survive anymore. We're being pushed into a trap, and we need to figure out what that trap is before we walk into it." She spread out their tactical map on the rocky ground. "Thompson's right about their movement pattern. They want us to head south, but I'm not going to dance to their tune." Sergeant First Class David Kim, their communications specialist, had been quiet during most of the discussion. Finally, he spoke up. "Commander, there's something else we need to consider. My radio equipment was damaged in the initial attack, but I've been picking up fragments of enemy communications. They're not speaking the local dialect. This sounds like foreign fighters, probably well-trained ones. That explained a lot. Local insurgent groups were dangerous, but they usually didn't use this kind of sophisticated tactical planning. Foreign fighters meant better training, better equipment, and probably better intelligence about American military operations. As Sarah studied the map and thought about their limited options, she noticed something she had missed before. There was an old structure marked on the map about half a mile to the north. It looked like it might be an abandoned outpost or storage facility from the Soviet era, when they had occupied Afghanistan decades earlier. Rodriguez, what do you know about that building up north? Rodriguez studied the map carefully. I remember seeing something in the mission briefing. It's supposed to be an old Soviet supply depot. Been abandoned since the 1980s. Intel said it was probably empty, nothing of tactical value. Sarah stared at the marking on the map. Something about it felt important, though she couldn't explain why. Sometimes in combat, you had to trust your instincts even when logic pointed in other directions. And right now, her instincts were telling her that abandoned Soviet outpost might hold the key to getting her team home alive. Against every tactical manual she had ever studied, Sarah made a decision that felt more like desperation than strategy. We're going to that Soviet outpost. If the enemy wants us to go south, then north is exactly where we need to be. Thompson raised an eyebrow. Commander, that means crossing 600 meters of open ground with minimal cover. In daylight, with hostiles watching our every move. I know the risks, Chief. But staying here means certain death, and walking into their trap south means the same outcome. At least this way we choose our own battlefield. Sarah folded the map and secured it in her vest. We move in 15 minutes. Light and fast. The team began their final preparations. Each man checked his remaining ammunition one more time, secured loose equipment, and mentally prepared for what could be their last movement together. Sarah watched them work with the quiet efficiency that came from years of training and combat experience. Rodriguez approached her with a concerned expression. Commander, I've been thinking about that outpost. If it's been abandoned since the 1980s, what makes you think it'll give us any advantage? Could be nothing but rubble and old concrete. Sarah had been asking herself the same question. Her decision was based on intuition more than tactical analysis. But sometimes that's all a commander had to work with. Sometimes the best hiding places are the ones everyone has forgotten about. And right now we need something the enemy hasn't planned for. The movement across the exposed ground was the longest 23 minutes of Sarah's military career. They moved in a staggered formation, using every piece of available cover: scattered rocks, small depressions in the ground, the shadows of larger boulders. The enemy continued their harassment fire, but it seemed less intense than before, almost like they were just keeping the Americans moving, rather than trying to eliminate them. When they finally reached the vicinity of the outpost, what they found was not what anyone had expected. The structure was larger than it had appeared on the map, built into the side of the mountain itself. Most importantly, it was not as abandoned as intelligence had suggested. Commander, look at this. Kim had discovered something near the entrance that made everyone stop and reassess their situation. Fresh tire tracks in the dust and not from military vehicles. These looked like they came from civilian trucks and they were recent. Sarah examined the tracks carefully. These are maybe 2 or 3 days old. Someone's been using this place. She looked up at the entrance to the outpost, a heavy wooden door that had been replaced sometime in recent years. Stay alert. We might not be alone here. Thompson took point as they approached the entrance. The door was unlocked, which immediately raised red flags for everyone. In this part of Afghanistan, nothing valuable was left unsecured. Either this place was truly empty, or whoever used it was very confident about their security. The interior of the outpost was a maze of concrete tunnels and storage rooms carved directly into the mountain. Soviet engineers had built this place to last, and despite decades of abandonment, the structure remained solid. But as they moved deeper inside, it became clear that recent occupants had been here. "This is recent," whispered Sergeant Miller, pointing to fresh food wrappers and water bottles scattered in one of the rooms. "Someone was here within the last few days." He picked up an empty ammunition box. And they were well supplied. Sarah felt a chill that had nothing to do with the cool temperature inside the mountain. If this place was being used by the same group that had them trapped outside, they might have just walked into an even worse situation. But as they continued exploring, she realized something that changed everything. In the deepest room of the facility, Rodriguez made a discovery that stopped everyone in their tracks. Behind a stack of old supply crates, partially hidden under a military tarpaulin, was equipment that didn't belong to local insurgents or even most foreign fighters. "Commander, you need to see this." Rodriguez's voice carried a tension that made everyone crowd into the small room. When he pulled back the tarpaulin, they found advanced communication equipment, detailed maps of American military positions throughout the region, and most disturbing of all, personnel files with photographs and personal information about American servicemen and women. Sarah felt her blood run cold as she flipped through the files. These weren't general intelligence reports. These were detailed personal profiles of specific American soldiers, including some members of her own unit. Information that could only have come from someone with access to classified military databases. "This isn't just a terrorist operation," she said quietly. "Someone on our side has been feeding information to the enemy." Thompson examined the communication equipment. "This gear is military grade, probably American or European. Definitely not something local fighters would have access to." He paused, studying a particular piece of radio equipment. "Commander, I recognize this model. We used these in Iraq. This came from our own supply chains." The implications were staggering. The ambush that had cost them 2 men, the perfect tactical knowledge the enemy had displayed, the way they seemed to know every move before the Americans made it. It all suddenly made sense. They weren't just fighting foreign insurgents. They were fighting an enemy that had inside information about their mission from the beginning. Kim discovered something else that made their situation even more complex. Hidden in a locked cabinet that Thompson had forced open was a collection of weapons that clearly didn't belong to typical insurgent forces. Among them were several American-made rifles, including one that caught Sarah's attention immediately. It was an M40A5 sniper rifle, the kind used by American military marksmen. But this one was different. It had custom modifications and bore the serial numbers that indicated it was one of a special batch manufactured for specific military units. Sarah had seen rifles like this before during her advanced weapons training. "This belonged to someone in our own forces," she said, running her hands along the weapon's familiar contours. "Question is, how did it end up in an enemy cache in Afghanistan?" As they continued searching the facility, the full scope of what they had discovered began to become clear. This wasn't just a storage area for stolen American equipment. It was a coordination center for a much larger operation that involved systematic intelligence gathering about American military activities in the region. Sarah realized that their current mission might have been compromised from the very beginning. Someone with access to classified information had provided the enemy with detailed knowledge about their insertion point, their objectives, and probably their extraction plans as well. The abandoned Soviet outpost had become something far more significant than just a place to hide from enemy fire. It was the key to understanding how deep the betrayal went, and possibly the key to getting her remaining team members home alive. But first, they would need to survive long enough to use what they had learned. While her team continued searching the outpost for useful supplies, Sarah studied the modified sniper rifle more carefully. Something about the weapon felt familiar beyond just its standard military specifications. She examined the custom modifications, a specialized scope mount, an upgraded trigger system, and unique grip modifications that spoke of a very particular user. "Rodriguez, come look at this." She called her wounded teammate over. Despite his injury, Rodriguez had the most experience with specialized weapons in their unit. "Have you ever seen modifications like these before?" Rodriguez examined the rifle carefully, running his fingers along the custom work. His expression grew troubled as he recognized something. "Commander, these modifications, I've only seen work this precise from one person. Master Chief Petty Officer David Hawkins. He was legendary for this kind of custom work." Sarah felt a chill of recognition. She knew that name. Hawkins had been killed in action 6 months earlier during an operation in this same region of Afghanistan. His body had never been recovered due to enemy fire, and his personal equipment had been listed as missing in action. "If this is Hawkins' rifle, how did it end up in an enemy cache?" Sarah asked, though she was beginning to fear she already knew the answer. Thompson overheard their conversation and joined them. "Hawkins went missing during Operation Desert Storm. My unit was part of the search and rescue effort. We assumed the enemy had overrun his position and taken his equipment as trophies. He paused, studying the weapon. But if his rifle is here in this kind of condition, with all this other intelligence material, the implications were clear to all of them. Either Hawkins had survived his reported death and was somehow involved in feeding information to the enemy, or someone had recovered his equipment and was using it as part of a larger operation to compromise American military activities. Kim had been monitoring enemy radio communications from their current position. He approached Sarah with new information that complicated their situation even further. "Commander, I'm picking up increased enemy chatter. They know we've moved to this location, and they're repositioning their forces. But here's the strange part, they seem confused about our intentions." "What do you mean, confused?" Sarah asked. "They keep asking each other why we would come to this place. One of them specifically mentioned that this location should have been evacuated days ago." Kim adjusted his radio equipment. "It sounds like whoever was using this outpost was supposed to have cleared out before our mission even began." Sarah began to piece together what might have happened. The enemy's tactical knowledge, their ability to predict American movements, the presence of classified intelligence and specialized American weapons, it all pointed to a coordinated operation that involved someone with access to high-level military planning. But something had gone wrong with their plan. The person or persons using this outpost as a coordination center had apparently left in a hurry, leaving behind evidence that could expose the entire operation. The enemy forces trying to eliminate Sarah's team weren't just trying to complete their original mission. They were trying to clean up loose ends. "Listen up," Sarah called her team together in the main storage room. "I think I understand what's happening here. We weren't just walking into a routine ambush. We stumbled into the middle of an intelligence operation that someone is trying very hard to cover up." She explained her theory about the outpost being used as a coordination center and the possibility that their mission had been compromised from the beginning. The grim faces of her team members reflected their understanding of how serious the situation had become. "So what's our play, Commander?" Thompson asked. "We've got evidence of a major security breach, but we're still outnumbered and outgunned. Even if we can get this information back to command, we have to survive long enough to deliver it." Sarah looked again at the specialized sniper rifle. Despite everything they had discovered, their tactical situation remained desperate. They were still trapped, still low on ammunition, and still facing an enemy that seemed to know their every move. But now they had something they hadn't possessed before, knowledge of why the enemy was so desperate to eliminate them. And they had found equipment that might give them an unexpected advantage. "Miller, Thompson, I want you to set up defensive positions at the two main entrance points to this facility. Use whatever materials you can find to create cover. We're going to make them come to us on our terms for once." Sarah shouldered the custom rifle. "Rodriguez, Kim, help me figure out how to use this communication equipment. If we can monitor their frequencies, maybe we can anticipate their next move instead of always reacting." As her team moved to carry out these orders, Sarah examined the sniper rifle more closely. The weapon felt balanced and familiar in her hands despite the custom modifications. During her advanced training years earlier, she had qualified as an expert marksman with similar weapons, though she had never had occasion to use those skills in actual combat. The scope mounted on the rifle was more sophisticated than anything in their unit's standard equipment. Looking through it, she could see enemy positions in the valley below with crystal clarity. For the first time since their mission had begun, Sarah felt like they might have a genuine tactical advantage, but using the rifle effectively would require her to expose herself to enemy fire, and it would mean taking shots at distances beyond anything she had attempted in real combat situations. The custom modifications suggested that whoever had used this weapon before was capable of extraordinary precision at extreme ranges. Kim's voice interrupted her thoughts. "Commander, I've got something on their communications. Sounds like they're planning a major assault on this position within the next hour. They're bringing up heavy weapons and additional personnel from their main camp." Sarah realized they had very little time to turn their new knowledge and equipment into a workable defense plan. The enemy was moving to eliminate them before they could escape with the intelligence they had discovered, and her small team would soon be facing odds even worse than what they had already survived. Looking out through a small window cut into the rock, Sarah could see enemy fighters moving into position for what would probably be a final assault. They were methodical and professional, confirming her suspicion that these were not ordinary local insurgents. These were trained soldiers carrying out a specific mission to ensure that no evidence of the intelligence operation survived. The forgotten rifle in her hands might be their only chance to survive long enough to get the evidence of betrayal back to American command. But using it would require her to become something she had never been before, not just a leader of soldiers, but a sniper capable of precision shooting under the most desperate circumstances imaginable. The enemy assault began exactly as Kim had predicted from their intercepted communications. Heavy automatic weapons fire echoed through the mountain valleys as hostile forces moved into coordinated positions around the outpost. Sarah watched through the sophisticated scope as enemy fighters advanced using textbook military tactics that confirmed these were professional soldiers, not irregular fighters. "Contact front," Thompson called out from his defensive position at the main entrance. "Multiple hostiles moving up the primary approach route. They've got RPGs and heavy machine guns." Sarah steadied herself behind an improvised shooting rest she had created using supply crates and concrete blocks. Through the scope, she could see the enemy commander directing his forces from a position about 800 meters away. That was well beyond the effective range of their standard infantry weapons, but possibly within reach of the custom rifle she now held. Taking a deep breath, Sarah lined up her first shot. The rifle felt strange in her hands, heavier than her training weapons but somehow more stable. The custom modifications that had initially seemed foreign now began to make sense as she adjusted her grip and sight. Picture. The shot rang out across the valley with a sharp crack that was distinctly different from the sound of standard military rifles. Through the scope, Sarah watched the enemy commander drop to the ground. For several seconds, the organized assault faltered as hostile forces tried to understand what had happened to their leader. "Outstanding shot, Commander," Rodriguez called out from his monitoring position. "You just eliminated their primary coordinator from 800 meters. I don't think they were expecting precision fire from this position." But Sarah knew one shot wouldn't change their overall tactical situation. The enemy had superior numbers and heavy weapons, and they would adapt quickly to the new threat. She needed to use the temporary confusion to maximum advantage. Kim's voice came over their internal communication system. "Commander, their radio chatter indicates they're confused about where that shot came from. They know someone has a long-range weapon, but they haven't identified the exact firing position yet." Sarah realized this was the advantage they needed. The enemy's own intelligence operation had worked against them. They knew the outpost was supposed to be empty, so they hadn't planned for the possibility of encountering a skilled marksman in a prepared position with specialized equipment. Moving to a different window, Sarah found another target, an enemy machine gun team that was setting up to provide covering fire for their advancing infantry. The range was even greater this time, nearly 900 meters. But the scope was so clear she could see individual faces. Her second shot eliminated the machine gunner, sending the rest of his team scrambling for cover and disrupting their planned fire support. Sarah was beginning to understand why this rifle had been modified so extensively. In the hands of a skilled marksman, it was capable of precision that could change the outcome of an entire engagement. "They're pulling back to reassess," Thompson reported. "Whatever you're doing with that rifle, it's got them spooked. They're not advancing like before." But Sarah knew the respite would be temporary. Professional soldiers would adapt to any tactical situation, and they would soon figure out ways to neutralize her advantage. She needed to use this time to do more than just slow their assault. Studying the enemy positions through the scope, Sarah began to understand their overall plan. They weren't just trying to overwhelm the outpost with superior firepower. They were trying to ensure that no one survived to report what they had found. This was an elimination operation designed to cover up the intelligence breach they had discovered. "Rodriguez, can you access those communication logs we found? I want to know who these people were supposed to report to." Sarah continued scanning for targets while she spoke. "If we can figure out the chain of command for this operation, we might be able to turn the tables on whoever is behind the intelligence leak." Rodriguez had been working with the captured communication equipment while monitoring his own radio. "Commander, I found something interesting. The communication logs show regular contact with a frequency that matches our own military communication bands. Someone was providing real-time updates about American operations directly to these enemy forces. That confirmation of what they had suspected made Sarah's next decision easier. They weren't just fighting to survive anymore. They were fighting to expose a betrayal that could compromise American military operations throughout the region. Sarah's third shot targeted an enemy sniper who had been trying to establish an overwatch position on a ridgeline. The distance was nearly 1,000 meters, at the extreme effective range even for the modified rifle. But when she squeezed the trigger, she watched the enemy marksman tumble from his position. "Unbelievable shooting, Commander," Miller called out. "I've never seen precision like that under combat conditions." But Sarah was beginning to realize something unsettling about her own performance. She was shooting better than she had ever shot before, making shots at distances and under stress conditions that exceeded her own training experience. The rifle seemed to be teaching her how to use it effectively, as if the weapon itself retained some memory of its previous user's skills. Kim had been monitoring enemy communications throughout the engagement. "Commander, their chatter is getting desperate. They're calling for additional reinforcements and heavy air support. But here's the interesting part. They keep mentioning that this mission has to be completed before sunset. After dark, they're supposed to withdraw regardless of mission status." Sarah understood the implications immediately. Whatever intelligence operation they had uncovered, it was operating under strict time constraints. The enemy had to eliminate all evidence and witnesses by nightfall, or they would have to abort the entire cover-up operation. That gave her team a chance, but only if they could survive the next few hours. And the enemy would throw everything they had at the outpost during that time, knowing they wouldn't get another opportunity. Looking through the scope again, Sarah could see enemy forces regrouping for what would probably be their final assault. They were bringing forward heavier weapons and more personnel, and they were moving more cautiously now that they knew about the long-range threat. But Sarah had learned something important about the rifle during the engagement. It wasn't just the hardware modifications that made it so effective. The previous user had zeroed the scope for specific conditions in this region: altitude, temperature, humidity, and wind patterns that were unique to these mountain valleys. Master Chief Hawkins had prepared this weapon specifically for long-range engagements in this exact location, which meant he had either survived his reported death and continued operating in the region, or someone else had been using his equipment to carry out missions that required extraordinary precision. Either way, Sarah now held in her hands a weapon that had been prepared by one of the most skilled marksmen in the American military, for exactly the kind of situation she now faced. The question was whether she could use it effectively enough to keep her team alive long enough to expose the betrayal that had cost American lives and compromised ongoing operations throughout Afghanistan. The final enemy assault came with a ferocity that shook dust from the concrete walls of the outpost. Heavy machine guns hammered at their defensive positions, while rocket-propelled grenades exploded against the mountain face above them. Sarah could hear her team members returning fire, but she knew their limited ammunition wouldn't last much longer against this overwhelming assault. Through the scope, she watched enemy forces advancing from 3 different directions simultaneously. They had learned from their earlier failures and were now using coordinated movement and suppressing fire to minimize their exposure to her long-range shots. Sarah realized she would have to take much greater risks to have any significant impact on this final attack. "Commander, they're closing fast on all approaches." Thompson's voice carried strain as he fired controlled bursts from his defensive position. "We need something to break up their advance or they'll overrun us within minutes." Sarah could see what Thompson meant. The enemy had committed everything to this assault, and they were advancing with the kind of professional coordination that would overwhelm any defensive position eventually. But studying their movement through the sophisticated scope, she began to notice something that gave her an idea. The advancing forces were being directed by hand signals from team leaders positioned at safe distances behind the assault groups. If she could eliminate those coordinators, the carefully planned attack might fall apart into chaos. But the shots would be extremely difficult, moving targets at varying ranges, all while under heavy fire herself. Moving away from the window where she had been shooting, Sarah climbed to a higher position within the outpost. It was more exposed to enemy fire, but it gave her better angles on the coordination positions she had identified. As she settled into the new firing position, Sarah felt something change in her relationship with the rifle. Instead of fighting the weapon's unfamiliar characteristics, she began to trust the modifications that Master Chief Hawkins had made. The heavy barrel that had initially felt awkward now provided the stability she needed for precision shooting under stress. The custom trigger that had seemed too sensitive now responded perfectly to her breathing and heartbeat rhythm. Her first shot from the new position took down an enemy team leader who was directing assault forces against Miller's defensive point. The immediate result was exactly what she had hoped for. The coordinated advance on that flank dissolved into confusion as subordinate fighters lost their direction and command structure. But taking that shot had exposed her position to enemy observers. Almost immediately, heavy automatic weapons fire began impacting around her location, sending concrete chips and dust flying. Sarah had to move quickly to avoid being pinned down or eliminated. Rolling to a different part of the elevated position, she found another angle on the second team leader. This shot was more difficult. The target was moving between covered positions and she would have only seconds when he was visible. Sarah controlled her breathing, led the target slightly to account for his movement, and squeezed the trigger at the exact moment he stepped into the open. The shot connected, and the second coordinated assault began to falter. But now the enemy knew exactly where she was shooting from, and they were directing concentrated fire at her position. Sarah realized she would have to abandon the elevated spot. But first she wanted to attempt one more shot that could change everything. Through the scope, she had identified what appeared to be the overall field commander for the entire assault. He was positioned on a ridge nearly 1,200 meters away, well beyond what any reasonable person would consider an effective shooting distance. But the custom rifle in her hands wasn't a reasonable weapon, and Sarah was beginning to understand that she wasn't shooting as a reasonable person anymore. The distance was so great that she had to account for significant bullet drop and wind drift. Sarah studied the environmental conditions, remembering everything she had learned about long-range shooting during her advanced training. But more than that, she tried to understand what Master Chief Hawkins had known about shooting in these specific conditions when he had prepared this rifle. As enemy fire intensified around her position, Sarah made a decision that went against every survival instinct she possessed. Instead of seeking cover, she fully committed to the shot. She adjusted her position to get the best possible stability, controlled her breathing to minimize any movement, and focused entirely on the distant target. The shot seemed to take forever to reach its target across the mountain valley. For several seconds, Sarah wasn't sure if she had connected. Then she saw the enemy commander fall, and within moments the entire assault began to collapse as unit leaders struggled to maintain coordination without overall command guidance. Outstanding. Outstanding. Rodriguez was shouting from his monitoring position. Commander, their radio communications are falling apart. They're calling for immediate withdrawal. You just broke their entire operation. But Sarah knew the engagement wasn't over yet. As the main assault forces pulled back in confusion, she could see smaller groups of enemy fighters moving to flanking positions. They were trying to salvage something from the failed operation, probably attempting to establish sniper positions from which they could prevent the Americans from leaving the outpost. This was where Sarah finally understood the full potential of the weapon she held. It wasn't just capable of long-range precision shooting. In the hands of someone who understood its capabilities, it could dominate an entire battlefield by eliminating threats before they could become effective. Over the next 20 minutes, Sarah methodically engaged enemy fighters as they tried to establish new positions. Each shot was carefully planned and precisely executed, using the superior optics and ballistic performance of the modified rifle to engage targets that would have been impossible to hit with standard equipment. Kim had been monitoring enemy communications throughout the engagement. Commander, they're in full retreat now. Their communications indicate they're abandoning the operation entirely. They keep mentioning that they can't complete the mission under current conditions. As the sound of gunfire faded across the valley, Sarah realized that something extraordinary had just happened. Her small team, trapped and outnumbered, had not only survived but had completely defeated a superior enemy force. And they had done it using intelligence gathered from the enemy's own operation and a weapon that had seemed forgotten until she had taken it in her hands. But more importantly, they now had evidence of a significant security breach that had cost American lives and compromised military operations. The intelligence materials they had found, combined with their combat experience against an enemy that clearly had inside information, would be enough to trigger a major investigation. Thompson approached her as she climbed down from the elevated shooting position. Commander, I've been in combat for 15 years and I've never seen anything like what you just did with that rifle. It was like watching someone who had been shooting from these positions for years. Sarah looked down at the modified weapon in her hands. She was beginning to suspect that Master Chief Hawkins had prepared more than just the rifle for operations in this region. The communication equipment, the intelligence files, the strategic position of the outpost itself. It all suggested a much larger and more complex operation than anyone had realized. The forgotten rifle had become the key not just to their survival, but to uncovering a betrayal that threatened American military operations throughout the region. And Sarah was starting to understand that her role in this story was far from finished. As the mountain valley fell silent except for the distant sound of retreating enemy forces, Sarah finally had time to process what had just happened. Her team had survived against impossible odds, but more than that, they had uncovered evidence of a betrayal that reached deep into American military operations. The modified rifle still felt warm in her hands, as if it had been waiting for this moment to reveal its true purpose. Kim's radio crackled with an incoming transmission. Team Martinez, this is Base Command. We have clear skies for extraction in 30 minutes. What's your status? Sarah took the radio, looking around at her surviving team members. They were battered and exhausted but alive. Base, this is Commander Martinez. Team is secure and ready for extraction. Be advised we have recovered significant intelligence materials that require immediate analysis. This operation was compromised from the beginning. There was a pause before Base Command responded. Commander, please clarify your last transmission. Are you reporting a security breach? Affirmative, Base. We have physical evidence of ongoing intelligence leaks to hostile forces, including classified personnel files and communication logs. Recommend immediate security review of mission planning for this entire region. Sarah knew her words would trigger a massive investigation, but the evidence they had found made it necessary. While they waited for the extraction helicopters, Sarah examined the intelligence materials more carefully. Hidden among the personnel files, she found something that changed her understanding of everything that had happened. It was a detailed operational report, written in English describing American military activities with the kind of inside knowledge that could only come from someone with direct access to classified information. But the report wasn't written by a foreign agent or a turncoat American soldier. It was written by Master Chief Petty Officer David Hawkins, and it was dated just 2 weeks earlier. Rodriguez looked over her shoulder as she read. Commander, that's impossible. Hawkins was killed in action 6 months ago. We attended his memorial service, and Sarah continued reading, and the truth began to emerge. Hawkins hadn't been killed. He had been captured, and instead of dying heroically as everyone believed, he had been turned by his captors. The detailed intelligence files, the modified rifle prepared for specific operations in this region, the communication equipment, it was all part of an intelligence-gathering operation that Hawkins had been conducting for the enemy, but something in the final entries of his report suggested that Hawkins had experienced a change of heart. His last communications indicated growing doubt about his cooperation with enemy forces, and his final report contained information that would actually benefit American operations rather than compromise them. Thompson examined the evidence. So Hawkins was feeding intelligence to the enemy, but then he started trying to help us. That doesn't make sense. Sarah found the answer in a personal journal hidden with the operational reports. Hawkins had been captured and tortured until he agreed to cooperate with his captors. But over time, as he provided intelligence that led to American casualties, he had become increasingly desperate to find a way to redeem himself. The outpost had been his attempt to provide American forces with actionable intelligence about enemy operations. He had been preparing to feed false information to his handlers while secretly helping American military units. But before he could complete his plan, enemy forces had discovered his change of loyalty. According to his final journal entry, Hawkins had prepared the modified rifle and positioned it in the outpost as a gift for whoever might find it. He knew he wouldn't survive his betrayal being discovered, but he hoped that the weapon and the intelligence materials would help other American soldiers accomplish what he no longer could. He wasn't just trying to redeem himself, Sarah realized. He was trying to warn us about how deep the intelligence compromise went. She showed the journal to her team. According to this, there are at least 3 other American servicemen who have been turned in similar operations throughout this region. The sound of approaching helicopters interrupted their discussion. As the extraction birds landed in the valley below the outpost, Sarah made a decision about the modified rifle. Instead of turning it in with the rest of the recovered equipment, she would keep it. Not as a trophy, but as a reminder of the complexity of war and the possibility of redemption, even in the most desperate circumstances. During the flight back to base, Sarah reflected on everything that had happened. She had begun this mission as a commander, leading a routine intelligence-gathering operation. She was ending it as someone who had experienced combat at a level she had never imagined possible, using skills she didn't know she possessed with a weapon that had been prepared by a man who had fallen, and then tried to rise again. The rifle had been more than just a tool for survival. It had been a bridge between her and a soldier who had faced impossible choices and had tried, in the end, to choose redemption over despair. In taking hold of the forgotten rifle, Sarah had also taken hold of Hawkins' final mission, to protect other American soldiers from the betrayals he had been forced to participate in. Back at base, the intelligence materials Sarah's team had recovered triggered the largest security investigation in recent military history. The communication logs and personnel files led to the identification and arrest of a network of compromised American servicemen throughout Afghanistan and Iraq. More importantly, it revealed systematic intelligence-gathering operations that had been responsible for numerous American casualties over the previous year. During the debriefing sessions that followed, Sarah was asked repeatedly about her extraordinary marksmanship performance during the final engagement. Military investigators found it difficult to believe that someone with her level of training could have made shots at the distances and under the stress conditions she had faced. Sarah never mentioned her feeling that the rifle had somehow retained knowledge from its previous user, or her sense that she had been shooting with skills that exceeded her own training. Those experiences remained private, part of her personal understanding of what had happened in that mountain outpost. 3 weeks later, Sarah received official notification that she was being recommended for the Navy Cross, the military's second highest decoration for valor. The citation mentioned her leadership under extreme conditions and her tactical innovation in using recovered equipment to defeat a superior enemy force. But for Sarah, the real significance of what had happened wasn't in the medals or recognition. It was in understanding that sometimes the most important tools for survival come from unexpected sources, and that redemption is possible even in the darkest circumstances. The modified rifle now occupied a place of honor in Sarah's personal equipment locker. It served as a reminder that in combat, the difference between victory and defeat often comes down to the willingness to take hold of opportunities that others might overlook or consider too risky to attempt. Master Chief Hawkins had fallen from grace, but in his final actions he had provided other American soldiers with the tools they needed to survive and succeed. The forgotten rifle had found its way into the hands of someone who could use it to honor both the living and the dead, completing a mission that had begun in betrayal but ended in redemption.